All right, everybody. So today we have Chris Barakat on the podcast. How you doing, man?
Doing great, man. Thank you for having me on, David. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So it's funny. I think the way I saw your account and we kind of talked a little bit was you had a transformation photo up, and I was tagged by somebody who will probably laugh seeing that I now have you on the podcast. And I figure podcast is great because it's like you know what, like the internet, you get a certain persona across on the internet. And a lot of times when you actually get to talk to somebody, it's different. And I think that's one of my favorite things about this podcast is getting having that time to actually go back and forth and have a discussion on something rather than just like a quick snippet on Instagram or something. So it's great
Yeah.
to have you on.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
So you actually mentioned that, and I didn't know this at the time, that you had just been interviewed on the Iron Culture podcast, right? On a similar topic that we're going to get into here on body recomposition and kind of like transformations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, we published my most recent paper I think it came out in August. And it kind of hit the ground running. It made its way around the entire evidence-based space. So, been talking a lot about body recomposition over the past 6 to 8 weeks, but
Yeah.
I absolutely love it. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation, man.
So let's get a little bit of your background for anybody who isn't familiar with you, and I'll have links to your stuff down below. But how did you get
Sure.
into the space?
Yeah, man. So I've always been interested in weight training. It kind of started off, my first passion was more martial arts as a very young kid, between 7 and 12. That was my focus. Then I transitioned to basketball, and then I started bodybuilding in high school, and I started competing at 19. I believe it was my sophomore year of college. Yeah. So got involved with natural bodybuilding and took an academic route. At first, that was in line with just kinesiology and learning more about the body. I studied athletic training, and I was going to go into physical therapy. I worked in that space for 6 years or so. But as I got more involved with competing and bodybuilding, I decided to pursue my master's in exercise and nutritional sciences, and I continued competing, and then started coaching kind of towards the very end of my undergrad, and it really blew up while I was in grad school. And that's basically what I've been doing is coaching physique athletes, coaching jump hop, competing. And then when I was a master's student, I got involved with the research. And now I teach at the university part-time, and I continue to research in the human performance lab. So, yeah, I've been doing that since 2016.
Very cool, man. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I saw some of your pictures up. Obviously, you have an impressive resume, both physically and also with your research.
Thanks,
Excuse
man.
me. As I mentioned to Chris before we started recording, I try to down some supplements, just the powder, and so I'm still working on that.
Dry
Uh,
scooping.
yeah, not a good idea.
Yeah.
So I had mentioned to you before, like an hour ago, I just finished a VO2 max test, which I've done once before, which is just it's awful, man. Like right beforehand, I'm like, all right, I got this. I get the music on, I'm motivated, and like it only takes about 10 minutes before you're just like, man, forget this. Like
Yeah.
it's tough. Have you done one?
I've never done one. No, I've never
Okay.
done one. We have the metabolic card in our lab. We have the equipment, and I've ran them for
Yeah,
athletes, but I've never
you've been
done
the
it
one
myself.
torturing people, but you haven't been
Yeah,
through it yourself.
I do wind gates, man. That's my kind of torture.
Yeah,
I would say VO2 max is definitely worse because it's so much longer. But
yeah, very
yeah,
long.
I put myself through pain in different ways, I guess.
Sure, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like I said, the main thing the first thing I had seen by you was this pretty crazy transformation that I believe the guy's name was something Robert, right?
Yep.
And that's a client of yours?
Not directly, actually. He
Okay.
was someone who kind of ran like a training program that I sell, and then utilized the nutrition guidelines that I put out in an ebook. So,
Okay.
yeah, just like an acquaintance and a friend. But yeah, his transformation was insane.
Yeah, it was insane. And, something that I've had people compliment me on this podcast is that I think a lot of podcasts, it's all agreeing the whole time. It's just like, oh, yeah. And like just kind of taking at face value. I like to push back a little bit. And so obviously that's part of why I wanted to have you on is just
Yeah.
because that was a crazy transformation. And it's not like I look at that and be like, these guys are lying, but it's more just like,
Sure.
I think what was the timeline on that? It was like a couple
eight
months,
weeks.
8 weeks.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll post up the pictures for people to make their own decision. But when I see that,
Yeah.
admittedly, I have a very hard time believing that that's 8 weeks. And then at first I was thinking like, well, they didn't claim that this was a natural transformation. But then I think later you mentioned it was a natural transformation, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
So that's even more like, Okay, like you very, very rarely see that. Like, where's the false marketing here? Like, what is this guy trying to sell me? So,
Yeah.
what results did you see, if we can put it in more objective terms?
Yeah, well, I believe his scale weight went up 8 pounds, and I think it was like from 198 to 206. I don't have the photo in front of me right now, but his scale weight went up pretty significantly over the 8 week time period. And if you look at the photo, he definitely dropped body fat, you know.
Sure, definitely.
So yeah, I mean, he just filled out, you know, tremendously. Part of it is definitely just like muscle fullness, but he put on relatively a decent amount of lean body mass and dropped fat mass simultaneously. So just to give you some context too, not about him in general, but when I started off in grad school, I was looking up to just the majority of the people that have research backgrounds in this evidence-based space that, you know, are 8 to 10 plus years older than me. And I wasn't expecting to see body recomposition on a regular basis at all. I honestly wasn't even thinking about it
Right.
when we were running our training studies. So our first training study we ever published was on autoregulation of exercise selection, and we were really just most curious on, okay, how much did these subjects grow muscle from a muscle thickness perspective regarding the ultrasound, and then how much lean body mass did they accrue, right? So that's what we reported in our study, but when I look at individual data, I saw that 5 out of those 17 subjects also lost fat mass while gaining lean body mass simultaneously. And I was just kind of fascinated about that. And it's also important to note that some of those same subjects that were eating relatively the same amount of protein, same amount of calories relative to their body weight, actually lost lean mass and gained fat mass. So the individual responses are just there's a very large magnitude in regards to how each individual is responding. And the issue with exercise science is we relatively have pretty small studies and we're constantly focused on the group means, and it's just not telling the entire story. So, you know, collecting the data and seeing the subjects, you see some people that make incredible progress and you see people that make minimal, and then you see people that regress. So I think it's really important to share that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it is a common problem to look at mean data and not look at the individual points. I mean, you see this with like some of the frequency recommendations and volume recommendations, and you'll say, well, we need higher frequency, but it's like, look at those data points. There are people who actually do worse with higher frequency. Wow, we need, this many sets of, for volume. Look at those data points again. Some people did actually respond worse. And so clearly, response is going to vary quite a bit. In the case of that individual, I mean, I agree. It's when you see the individual data, there's a huge contrast. There's I don't see a huge point in going back on like that individual transformation. Obviously, it was
Sure.
pretty crazy, but people could argue back and forth on one specific person and say, is that really possible? I guess I've just not really seen anything like that, even in person and with like people. I mean, I have friends I've had friends who've taken steroids who still look like crap, which is another
Sure.
genetic variation of how well do you respond to steroids. I have friends who have taken it and look amazing, but I've almost never seen anything that quickly. So, like I said, for me, it's hard to believe, but I don't assume you're lying. It's not like I mean, I guess you have a program you mentioned, but it's probably just one of those freaky examples. Now,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. So, the thing with him, that's just a photo that's clearly demonstrating recomposition. I wish I had like true objective numbers on him.
Yeah.
But I can share DEXA data that will just completely blow your mind. Like
Yeah.
you won't believe me, but it is what it is, and I can share that with you. So
No, I'd love to see it. I mean, how much
yeah,
would that, in terms of lean body mass gained, would you take into consideration like a difference in hydration there?
actually no, I wouldn't take into consideration hydration. I would say there's a large shift between intracellular and extracellular fluid, but actual hydration status would be relatively the same, if that makes sense. So, um, and something, DEXA gets critiqued quite frequently
Hmm.
in the space, and I honestly think it's not warranted at all, because when we are testing our subjects, they're coming into the lab under the same conditions, so they're fasted for the same amount of time.
Right.
It's not like one time they're coming in fed and they drank a gallon of water, and another time they're coming in dehydrated and they didn't eat for 14 hours or something crazy. It's the same condition. So if you actually look at the data that compares, DEXA to something like MRI or whatever it
Mhm.
may be, it's actually extremely consistent. Is there some margin of error? Absolutely, but it's actually quite small. So I don't think that's fair. It gets a lot of kind of negative connotations, and I think it's better than bioelectrical impedance. And
Oh,
what I've
sure.
seen is whoever has X equipment in their lab or wherever they came out of, they try to kind of favor that and say like, oh, this is really good equipment. And then if they
Right.
don't have X, Y, and Z equipment, they say like, oh, that equipment's not that reliable. It's just not
Right.
true. Um,
So, yeah, in theory,
mhm.
if somebody were to, do a DEXA, drink a gallon of water, do a DEXA, that would, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, show like 8 pounds more lean body mass. But when you have a DEXA, at least the DEXA I've seen and the one that I had done on myself, it separates the lean body mass into like trunk and limbs and things like that too. So, that would be one way to distinguish something like that.
Yeah, I've never tested that, like actually drank a gallon and see how much lean mass goes up, but it definitely would go up to some extent. We just got a new tool in our lab. It's a BIS. It's similar to BIA, and what we're going to do now is a four-compartment model. So we're going to use the DEXA and combine it with the BIS, and then we're essentially going to have total body water, intracellular, extracellular, and then lean mass, fat mass, and bone mineral density. So I'm really excited to share our results with like as much detail as possible rather than having a three compartment model. But that's a little off topic. Can I share? You want me to share some like random outliers from
Yeah,
some of
yeah,
our
go for
research
it.
studies? Yeah, man.
Definitely.
So the first study, this was published in 2017, I believe. It's by Rauch and colleagues. My buddy Jacob Rauch is the head author. It was looking at autoregulation of exercise selection. Some of the biggest outliers or the most significant outliers. One guy gained 9.4 pounds of lean mass while losing 1.87 pounds of fat mass.
You said
And
this is
then
what time frame?
this is a 10-week training period, I believe,
Okay.
maybe 9-week training period. And then another subject gained 8.6 pounds of lean mass while losing 4.2 pounds of fat mass. So they were doing full body sessions 3 days a week in the lab, and they weren't doing anything else. They weren't training anything else.
And these
Um,
were trained subjects, you said, or
Pretty well trained. Yeah, and again, there's a variance between all of them. Um, they have to squat at least 1.75 times their body weight even to qualify. But if you look at our means of squat and bench, they were pretty strong people. And then in our most recent study, which was a volume study that was published this year, it's by Aube and colleagues. We looked at different volumes in training the lower body, 12 sets per week, 18 sets per week, 24 sets per week. We didn't share total body composition data within the study. What we did was we shared muscle thickness data and we shared lean body mass data of the quadriceps, hamstrings, and glutes only. So utilizing the DEXA, we're able to select a region. It's called region of interest, and we just used from their hip to their knee to get their entire glute, entire quad, entire hamstring, and we reported the lean body mass gains there because it was a lower body study only. So we didn't
mm,
control what they did for upper body. So we didn't really see the point of reporting total body changes. But I still have that data because we obviously scanned everybody, right? And there was one subject that this is the one you're not going to believe. He gained 9.2 kilograms of lean mass while losing 1.8 kilograms of fat mass. And that was in 8 weeks.
yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, now this is more believable in the sense that like you actually have the data. There's somebody else, I won't say who, but like there was somebody in like the industry who I think is a reputable person, I think an honest person, and he was telling me strength numbers of a family member who doesn't even lift that much, and they were astronomical, like to the point that they would easily break like world records. And I'm like, I mean, and I'm like, you seem like a very nice, honest guy. I can't imagine why you would lie to me,
Yeah.
but you're literally talking numbers that would like blow Larry Wheels away. So I can't believe, like, I just can't bring myself to believe you. Whereas
Sure.
like with this, it's like you have data, and
Yeah.
my mind kind of goes towards like, how could that be wrong somehow? Just because it's so
Sure.
crazy. But
Yeah.
I mean, if you have the data, you did the measurements, like it, I
Yeah.
guess I believe you.
To be to tell you make a funny pointer about that, when we saw that particular subject come in,
Mhm.
we were so mind blown. We made him come in the second day to double check. We made him come
Mhm.
in the following day because that was the craziest stuff,
Yeah, got
you
the
know,
same measurement.
our entire team has seen. Yeah, we basically got the same thing, no significant difference. It was different by like zero point 0.2 kilograms, plus or minus
Did
lean
he?
mass and fat mass. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
I want to give you some info on him, but ask the question and
I was
I'll
just gonna
definitely talk
say,
to you about it.
I don't know how much you saw him. I guess you saw him somewhat frequently if they were doing the training. Did you, when you looked at him, was it like, holy crap, like what is happening to this guy?
Yeah. So we saw him twice a week. They're training legs twice a week, and he was training upper, probably 3 times per week. I think he was training 5 days per week total. So his entire physique changed. But I want to give you some info about this one particular guy. So
Yeah.
to when you're describing how well trained someone is in the literature, you can use terms like recreationally trained, well trained, advanced, elite, whatever. A lot of times it's based off of their starting strength numbers. So, what did they bench relative to their body weight and body mass? What was their squat 1 RM relative to their total body weight, right? So
Right.
for this study, all subjects needed to squat 1.75 times of their body mass for their 1 RM, and it is a box squat, just to qualify, just to be allowed to enter. Our mean was like 2.09, which is like one of the strongest cohorts ever studied. So we had
Yeah.
really strong subjects. Um, and this particular subject, he played basketball, like college basketball, and he has never done bodybuilding training. He's never done hypertrophy, but he knows how to squat. He knows how to bench because he does strength and conditioning with the team. But his level of muscularity is so far away from his potential. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
From his maximum muscle potential if he pursued something like bodybuilding. So even though he was well trained, quote unquote, he's never done bodybuilding before, right? So
Right.
you take this athlete that has great genetics, ton of potential, and never has really tapped into his like hypertrophy muscularity kind of potential, and
Right.
then you put him in a very intense training environment. I mean, the most intense training environment he's ever been a part of, and then he's training, 3 times per week outside of the lab doing upper body work. That's why we saw these crazy numbers, but the crazier thing with him, again, talking about recomp, he started off at 9.38% body fat and he finished at 6.5. So I generally say recomposition is more likely to occur the more body fat you have and the more
Sure.
untrained you are.
Right.
So if you think of those things on a sliding scale, like the more untrained you are and the higher fat you have, the most amount of potential you have to recomp. And then the leaner you are and the more advanced you are, the less likely or the less you should ever expect to recomp. But this subject was like very lean, but pretty much untrained from a hypertrophy muscle building standpoint,
Right.
right?
Right.
So he really maximized his growth. And I genuinely think he lost some fat mass because his body was adapting at such a quick rate to all the resistance training that he used some of that, endogenous fat stores to kind of fuel that process.
Right. Sure.
So yeah, it was super interesting, and that's the craziest thing I've ever seen. But it's important to share that just so people know, like, okay, this stuff actually happens. In that last podcast I did on iron culture, I mentioned a lot of people take like what one expert says or like what they hear on a radio show or a different podcast to just like be black and white truth. And I think that's really dangerous because then we start creating self-limiting beliefs and then we start accusing other people of cheating just because you're seeing results that are atypical. Just because something's atypical doesn't mean it's, impossible or someone's doing
Sure.
something wrong. So I think, take everything with a grain of salt, but also don't shoot yourself in the foot and think like your genetics suck and you have no potential and like why even try.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think athletes that have never done bodybuilding training, but have done very well in their athletic background are really, they have a lot of potential to tap. I mean, the average like basketball player or something like that, they probably have never done like really, other than sports specific training, they may have really never done this like kind of bodybuilding training. So again, that the numbers you're telling me are pretty wild, but I could believe it. And if he was a basketball player, I imagine he was quite tall, I'm
Yep.
assuming.
Yep.
So, more of a frame to fill out. You do see some really freaky examples out there. I mean, there was a guy like easily the most muscular guy in my high school, top like wrestling athlete and everything. By the time he was 17 years old, he was like 200 pounds at 5'9", lean. I mean, he was a freak. Like to this day, after 15 years, I probably could not hang with his 17-year-old self in the gym. And so, you do see some freaky people out there.
Absolutely. I saw a photo of Brandon Curry recently
Hmm.
when he was like 17 or 19 at his first competition. He says he was 100% natural. I totally believe it. He said he didn't really know anything about anything.
Yeah,
And, looks like he's carrying more muscle than I'll ever build in my entire life. And he was probably messing around for like 4 months in the gym and just
probably. Yeah,
looked absolutely insane. Have you seen photos of Phil Heath as a college basketball player?
I have. Yeah, I mean, even
Yeah, I
just his
mean,
muscle bellies are just so ridiculous. It's crazy.
yeah, like he could win a natural bodybuilding show without like bodybuilding, like just diet him
Yeah.
down and like teach him how to pose.
I think there's quite a few pictures of Kai Green in his natural days, and like you said, I believe he was natural at the time. It's
Yeah.
funny though, because like I think it was the first Generation Iron movie. They call like Phil Heath the gift, and Kai Green is like, oh, like you can keep your gifts. Like I don't need like to have like the best genetics, and I'm like, okay, yeah, Kai, like you definitely have some terrible genetics, or the second best in the world.
Sure. Yeah, it's
So
wild, man.
what what was you mentioned that this guy, the guy who I posted the picture of, or I will be posting the picture of, he was doing, you said, a routine that you had put out. Is that right? A
Yeah,
program?
Jordan. Yeah, so his IG handle was like Jordan Roberts. So his name's Jordan Meadows or Jordan Roberts.
Okay.
Yeah, so this transformation took place couple years back, man. And in 2017, I put out like my first program to the masses. Kind of, it's called my Extreme Training Program. It's super high volume. You're basically training everything 3 times every 8 days. Um, I ran it for a long time. It's not really how I train right now,
Mhm.
but so many people did it, and I mean, everyone loved it. It was great. It produced great results, and that's what Jordan Meadows did during that transformation progress. So that was just 8 weeks. He said he was doing a decent amount of skateboarding simultaneously, so that
Mhm.
was like his cardio.
Yeah.
But I think something that I want to touch on really quick in regards to that transformation and just body recomposition as a whole. A lot of people think like you need to eat in a calorie deficit or a calorie maintenance for this to occur. In his case, I would say he was in a surplus just because he gained so much body weight
Yeah.
and he still underwent this recomposition effect. So I think people need to, it's good to have a general idea of like what a surplus is going to do and what a deficit's going to do, but also don't get too caught up in the black and white thing because a calorie deficit does guarantee fat loss, but a calorie surplus does not guarantee muscle gain, right? So if I eat 300 grams of protein per day and 4,000 calories per day, I will build zero muscle if I'm not resistance training. So like a lot of people think a little bit too black and white where it's like surplus is building muscle, deficit's losing fat. And
Right.
there's so much amazing things that can happen at maintenance that the research has shown happens in the surplus. Like if you look at Jose Antonio's protein overfeeding studies,
Right.
some of these groups, they're eating like 490 calories more on a daily basis, and they end up losing more fat mass than the group eating fewer calories per day and fewer protein per day. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. It's extremely complex, and I understand that we like to give good information in a way that's as simple as possible, but sometimes we do a poor job by oversimplifying things that are very complex.
Right. And I think one of the reasons that like I'm sure I have a bias is when I look at my background, like I've been very consistent for about 15 years. I have only ever really, at least any extended period of time, gained muscle while I was bulking up in a surplus. And with that came significant fat gain and vice versa. I only ever really lost fat on the way down, and with that, some strength and muscle loss.
Sure.
I know it's commonly talked about that, one of the objections to saying like the body recomposition thing happens is, oh, it's either when you're new, when you do steroids, or when you're after a detraining period. And you're showing that it's not necessarily after a detraining period. However, I would almost wonder if you're able to recomp to that degree, I feel like you must have inherently been doing something, not what I would call wrong, but you inherently were doing things suboptimally. Maybe you just didn't know it, but and like if I think of like again myself, there's no way to know that I was doing things optimally. But I have numerous friends who, they're into lifting, but they stop for months at a time. And then obviously those are good examples where they could recomp quite well because, they've stayed the same weight. So they've lost muscle, they've gained fat. But I've also followed the evidence-based literature for forever, really, even since I got started. So protein has always been sufficient. I've always focused on at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep. I've always been consistent with training. I've done what I think is fairly optimal frequency. So I feel like because of that, I've never experienced a recomp in my life.
Yeah.
And I've never had more than like 2 weeks off ever. So, but I could see how like if you're just somebody who you lift, you like it, but maybe you don't focus on protein that much, or you don't focus on like getting everything ideal. There's obviously a lot more potential there for a recomposition effect.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people are consistent, but they're leaving potential gains on the table by not, optimizing every variable. So you mind if I ask you, like, what was your starting weight 10, 15 years ago, and then, maybe how much muscle you've built over your time frame?
Yeah, so I would say I'm definitely not like a non-responder, but I'm an example of somebody who started so skinny that now that I put on probably 50 pounds, I look more or less like normal. So
Okay.
I was a freshman, 5'11", 130 pounds in high
Wow.
school, very, very skinny. And that was not like I was naturally a fat kid, but I kind of got like borderline anorexic, I would say. And I mean, I didn't think I was, but like if you look at me, you're like, yeah, there was some issues that I felt the need to get that light.
Sure.
And then now I'm 6'1" and 185 pounds, and abs not shredded by any means. I mean, if you see any pictures on my Instagram, like lean, beach lean.
Sure.
So how much muscle is that compared to like bone growth and everything from the extra 2 inches? But obviously it's a
Sure.
huge difference over the 15 years.
Yeah. So you would say your body fat percent is similar at your current 185 versus your previous like 130?
Similar, yeah.
Similar. I mean, that's impressive. I think a huge thing to physiques and aesthetics overall is totally out of our control, where it's bone structure and it's muscle belly structure, insertion points, and
Right.
everything like that. So like just to give you guys some insight and to just shoot the shit and talk to you.
Yeah.
My first few years of lifting was in high school, and I was around 135 pounds, and I might have went up to like 145 at most. I feel like I kind of stayed between 135 and 140, even while like resistance training 5 days a week. I just literally did not even know that, hey, I need to eat more food to gain
Right.
weight in general. Like if I'm gonna build muscle, like I was lean obviously at 135, right? I was a skinny basketball player, so
How
like
tall roughly?
5'7" ish.
Okay.
So, my ability to build muscle was hindered because I just wasn't eating enough calories, period. Protein and calories as a whole. And then my first 3 years of training or so, I stayed at a very similar weight. I got up to like 150 after maybe my freshman year of college. And then my first prep, I literally cut from like 150 to 140, and I was stage lean at 140, and it wasn't impressive. And then I finally started doing research and learning from other people in the field, like Eric
So you
Helms
you
and
actually
Dr. Norton.
competed before you really even got into like all the information.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So like I'm a competitive person with myself, and when I stopped playing high school basketball and didn't play college basketball, I was still training 5 days a week in the gym, but didn't have a competitive purpose. So my freshman year of college, I met who's one of my best friends now. He was competing in a natural bodybuilding show, and I didn't even know what natural bodybuilding was.
Right.
I went to see his show. I thought all of those guys were taking drugs. I was like totally blown away and impressed. I thought the teenage bodybuilder was juiced to the gills, right? Like being a spectator and not knowing anything about the sport. Now, like I'm friends with that person who I thought was totally juiced up. And I learned more about the sport. And then I competed in the same show the very next year. Long story short, my first 3 years sucked. And then after my first show, and I started learning about this crap, I finally made my newbie gains. I put on 14 pounds of stage weight in like an 18-month time period. So that was probably like 15 months of quote unquote bulking and then like 3 months of cutting. Yeah. And I finally made my newbie gains, but it was like my fourth year of lifting, not my first year of lifting. You know what I'm saying? Right. So I spun my wheels for so long. And I think some people kind of fall into that category where, they go to the gym a few days per week and they do train pretty consistently and they just feel like they've never made progress. And it's probably because like they're just not eating properly and they're not recovering and the whole line.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a great point. Like just because somebody is, I mean, you were obviously a competitive person, you obviously took the endeavor seriously, but you weren't nearly optimizing everything. And so I probably take that for granted sometimes, assuming that like, well, if you watch my podcast or you're in this space, you know what's ideal, or even that like you're doing what's ideal, which is obviously often not the case. And you mentioned, I mean, even at 5'7", what did you most recently compete at?
My most recent one was like 156.
Okay. I mean, that's pretty good, man. I mean, that's like the weight I think Alberto Nunez competes at roughly, and he's a couple inches taller. So
yeah, I think he's hit like lows of 159s or 157s. It's bodybuilding is really interesting. I tell myself like I don't want to compete again below 150 ever. So I want to compete this upcoming year in 2021, and my goal and my plan, man, is I better be 160 or above on stage. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't want to go out there. So.
And it's been how many years for you?
I've been lifting for probably like 12, 13 years pretty consistently. Okay. My first show is 2011, so my next show will be a decade of gotcha. Like competing.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, it's tough with like natural bodybuilding because I mean you look at like somebody like Eric, and I think he was lighter at like each subsequent competition. Yeah. I just talked to Brian Whitaker like 2 days ago.
Oh, sick.
And yeah, he was like one of like the originals, It was cool to talk to him. And I think I'm forgetting the weights right now, but when he won Worlds, he was like 2 or 3 pounds lighter than when he went pro. So, not to tell you that you couldn't do that or anything as far as the weight gain. It's just sometimes in natural bodybuilding, people go the other way.
Yeah, for sure. I think Brian steps on stage around 163, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 161. But yeah, I follow Brian pretty closely, so I love what he's done in the sport. And that's what's cool about natural bodybuilding. Like I've seen Brian at expos and we've connected a few times, and like in a t-shirt, he looks like good, like he looks athletic, but you would never think he's a world champion. Right. And I'm actually super close with someone that he beat my buddy Siobhan Cunningham, who's like a brother to me. And Siobhan's beat him in the past, and Brian got the best of him one time. But if you see Siobhan in a shirt, he just has like that 3D look, like very round muscle bellies. And if you just saw Brian and Siobhan like walking down the street, you would say like, oh, Siobhan's the bodybuilder and Brian's like the recreational lifter. But right. That's what's cool about bodybuilding. You peel someone down and they hit some poses and they're super shredded, and it's just a totally different ball game. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's weird. It can be frustrating given how much of it is completely out of your control. Like there's a lot in your control, obviously, right? Like, you can make sure you're shredded, you can gain muscle. Posing is a big one that I think is underutilized. But like for me, like I've never stepped on stage. I have no intention to for several reasons. But at 6'1", so I was just saying this to Brian, I have a 6'4" arm span. Okay, I have very long, like my brother is a similar height, but my limbs are each like 2 inches longer than him. And it's great for sports, like I was a pretty good athlete, but it sucks for bodybuilding. Like just like the same measurements would just look so much smaller. Yeah. So I just don't have like the interest in like just getting like smoked by somebody who's like 30 pounds lighter than me. But also it makes it interesting in what type of body you gravitate towards, right? So like I have a friend who is 5'5", looks really good, stays lean year round, and at 5'5", 145, he actually looks pretty good. And the way he is shaped, like it makes sense for him. His like best look, I would say, is pretty similar to that, maybe like 141 or 145, 150. For me, given my height, I look like at 200 in clothes. It's like, okay, I look built, but I don't necessarily, I'm not like rushing to take my shirt off.
Sure,
But then
sure.
at like 180, like when I did this VO2 max test today, the nurse was like, oh, like you look really fit. And it's like, thanks. But like with clothes on, I kind of look like nothing. I mean,
Sure.
6'1" at 185 isn't exactly like a big guy. So
Yeah.
depending on your physique and your genetic strong points, I feel like the weight you sit at and when you look good can really vary a lot.
Absolutely. I look way better in clothes in my quote unquote improvement season.
Right,
Like
right.
right now I'm like 182-ish and like I at 5'7" you look like a little bit thick.
Yeah.
Um, but when I'm stage lean, I mean people wouldn't even bat an eye. Dude, it's so funny being in commercial gyms when you're stage lean. So like you'll go in there with a sweatshirt on, no one's looking at you. Maybe halfway through your workout, you take your sweatshirt off, you might have a t-shirt on, no one's still looking at you. You go into a stringer, you hear like people whispering like, "Oh, that guy's taking shit."
Yeah, right,
It's like,
right.
yeah, I'm like 150 pounds. I'm sure I'm taking all the gear in the world right now. So
Yeah, no, the
it's
pump
interesting.
is amazing. Like the leaner you get, the more impressive that pump gets. And it's like during quarantine, I had to work out at home, and
Yeah.
so I never saw myself in my home mirror like directly after workout. It'd be like 20 minutes have gone by, I eat, and then I go take a shower. So
Yeah.
seeing that pump like right after, I'm like, holy shit! Like I need to
Yeah.
keep working out at home.
Yeah.
But obviously, the fatter I get, the more that goes away.
That's funny, man.
So, I'll probably have a link to the Iron Culture podcast as well, just for anybody who wants to see more there. Anything that we didn't touch on regarding body composition that you'd like to mention, or you think we did a good job covering it?
I mean, yeah, there's so much to talk about. It's really up to you, you know. It's definitely possible. Obviously, it happens. If you're someone who doesn't have the opportunity to have like objective data, don't panic about that. Just take progress photos and use circumference measurements alongside your scale weight. So don't get too caught up in, oh, just like my body weight's going up or down or my body weight's not changing. Your composition can be changing. So um, using a waist circumference measurement is a really good tool to tell if you're gaining fat or losing fat. And that's what I do with my clients because not everyone has access to all these tools. So I think that's
Right.
important. And we can talk about, whatever you want, but yeah, we covered some main points.
Yeah, I guess that probably the only other question that really came to mind was, would you say that when you find somebody who was able to recomp very well, do you find like, we kind of all have a lot of people who are in this space have these principles in mind and they think like, okay, you're not optimizing nutrition, you need to like sleep more. You're not optimizing XYZ. Do you find that a lot of these recomp transformations have come from like the same implementations, if that makes sense? Like, oh, they had to do more volume or they had to just sleep more. Or would you say that like, for three different individuals, there were three different protocols that like they were significantly different, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So from what I've seen with the clients I've worked with, I can share more details because in regards to the subjects in the lab, we know what their macronutrients are, but I don't know like what their nutrient timing and meal frequency is like.
Mhm.
But in regards to the clients I work with, their training needs to be more progressive than it has been in the past. A lot of people, depending on their level, they don't even necessarily logbook or know exactly what they're lifting each week, and they haven't really objectively quantified like what have they previously done and work towards doing something more. I kind of use an example like if someone says like I'm going to go run a mile, like they pay attention to how long it took to run that mile and they try to
Mhm.
beat their 1 mile run all the time. Like it's just
Right.
common sense. But so many people in a commercial gym, like they go in there and they lift weights, but they don't write anything down and they just do something totally different the next time. So having more structure with their training is huge and progressing throughout their training is massive. Doesn't necessarily have to be more volume. It could be less volume, but just better quality, not quantity. I think that's really, really important. And then in regards to like nutrition with my clients, it's typically like I increase their protein a bit compared to what they were previously doing. And then believe it or not, I'm a pretty big advocate for more frequent protein feeding. So if someone eats
Mhm.
3 meals per day, I usually increase them to five protein feedings. I never do more than six, but kind of depends where they start off at. I really do think like that makes a difference over time.
Is
There's
that
a
based anecdotally, or do you think the research is like that's what you've seen in the research?
there's one study that I kind of refer to all the time because there isn't a ton of good data in this, but it was by Asiero and colleagues. I believe it was Brazilian or Spanish or something like that. But they had they had a really cool study. They had 3 meals per day versus 6 meals per day. Um, Macronutrients were equated. The first like 3 weeks or so was a maintenance phase. So they just had both groups eat 3 meals per day, 6 meals per day at caloric theoretical maintenance. And then they had an extended period of a true calorie deficit. I believe they chose 500 calorie deficit. And the group that was eating 6 meals per day at the same macros as the 3 meals per day group retained significantly more lean body mass and lost more fat mass compared to the group that had the 3 meals per day. So that wasn't a resistance training study. So they didn't like recomp and build muscle, but they preserved more muscle and lost more fat mass by doing that. And then like with all the protein overfeeding studies, it's just like if someone's eating 200 grams of protein per day, I really don't recommend them doing like 70 grams a meal 3 times. I would rather them split it up
Right.
into 5 meals, you know what I'm saying? So you're going to kind of maximize NPS more frequently in each single feeding. So, I mean, theoretically, it makes sense from what I've seen with my clients and some of the data. It leads to making sense, man. And we need to sometimes respect what bodybuilders have been doing for the last
Right.
50 years. And it's not just like, the data doesn't really support
Right.
it yet. So,
Can you
yeah.
send me that paper? I'll include it in the show notes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, even like I try to be very evidence-based, but I think like even somebody like Brad Schoenfeld, who is the guy putting out the studies showing that like failure doesn't really benefit. He himself says like he still believes like maybe we're just not picking something up, when the guys like John Meadows and Scott Stevenson, like they really feel like there is a benefit to it.
Yeah.
I actually am surprised when I see that, like how much the evidence really doesn't support failure training. I guess just like because from day one, I grew up on like progressive overload and pushing as hard as possible.
Yeah.
So even like when you say like, people just don't try to beat what they did last time, like that's just a foreign thing to me because it's like always what I'm focused on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it just feels like, when I push myself to failure, it will do more. And I'm not even saying that's actually correct. It's just how it just seems right,
I totally agree. I try to failure pretty regularly, I advise my clients to. I think some of what goes on in the research is we got to pay attention to the demographics that we're looking at. And like, is there a massive difference between 2 RIR and 1 RIR? No. That's not going to make a huge change. At least you're training like quote unquote hard enough. But I think if we had a research study where like subjects saved 5 to 6 reps in the tank compared to, saving 1 to 0 reps in the tank, I would hope that they would find significant differences there.
Seriously.
But yeah, man, I advise that too. And I kind of think along the same lines of you. It feels like, okay, this is going to force my body to adapt to a greater degree rather than saving a bit in my tank. So yeah, I hear you, man.
For sure.
Yeah.
Dude, well, I'm glad I got tagged in that post of yours. I'm glad we got to connect. This was a
Likewise,
good conversation. Where are you based, by the way?
I live in Tampa, Florida. So I teach at the University of Tampa. I research out of that lab. The senior of my lab is Dr. Eduardo de Souza, awesome researcher from Brazil that's, been here for probably 6 years now. And he's kind of my mentor in the academic research space.
Awesome.
So yeah, I'm at UT.
Yeah, my sister went to University of Tampa, and I know. Do you know Scott Stevenson?
Oh wow, yeah, that's my boy. Yeah, we text all the time. So.
Oh really? Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
Scott's the man. I mean, he's been on probably like 4 times now. We
Oh,
talked
wow.
quite a bit. So
Yeah.
at some point, maybe I got to get down to Tampa, and we can all get a lift in.
For sure, that would be sick, man. That would
I'll
be
be
super
staying very covered up in a hoodie next to you guys, even if it's 90 degrees down there.
cool. I'll be wearing a hoodie too. Trust me. I'll stay covered up too, man.
All right, man. So where can people find more of your stuff?
Yeah, so for educational content, you guys can check out schoolofgains.com. Gains is spelled with a Z. And on that website, you will see like some free blog articles. All the podcasts I do, I've previously done, will be on there. Some educational videos from my YouTube channel. And then like the formal peer-reviewed research is all linked there. So you can see the stuff that I've done and what I'm kind of currently working on. And then obviously the programs I sell are there. So I have training programs there. And I do want to plug the Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition, which me and Jeff Nippard worked on and released in 2019. So that's a great guide to kind of cross all your T's and dot all your I's nutritionally. And that's where I coach people out of too. And then on Instagram, I'm most active from a social media perspective. So that's just my full name. It's at Christopher.Barakat.
Awesome. Thanks again, man.
Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.